Hi, it's Carrie and Melissa from Somewhere to Share and Huellas. Today, for our Sustainable Summer Series, Melissa is going to talk to us a little bit about Huellas when you're also tied to a textbook. And so I'm just we're trying to keep this short and sustainable. So I'm bowing out right now and I'm going to turn this over to Melissa.
Yeah, so this is definitely one of those topics that I could talk a lot about, mainly because I have been in two school districts where we have been working on transitioning. So I was at one school district for 8 years. And when I first started, it was completely textbook based. And I wasn't really sure even what kind of language students had at that point. And then now I'm at a different school, and this will be my third year at this new school. And we're working on transitioning both the lower levels and kind of working some of those things in some of the upper level classes as well. So with that said, I think it's important to kind of talk about what is in a textbook. How does this even work? So in a book, typically, and most books are formatted the same, you have your vocab and it's pretty lengthy. You have your two grammar lessons, and then you have these nice little culture boxes that just randomly pop up to give you that needed culture that your students find interesting, but it can only be contained in this one little footnote box. And it's pretty standard throughout each chapter. Students are exposed to a lot of vocabulary, some of it not really high frequency, some of it kind of irrelevant depending on what textbook you're using and the technology unit that your textbook was formatted in.
So you're saying floppy disk is
exactly. Fax machines and granted, fax machines are still completely relevant.
Beeper/pager.
Exactly. VHS player, all of these outdated words, and words that I don't even use, or my husband who's from Mexico has never heard of these words before. So it's not really language that students would hear on a frequent basis. And then the grammar is so isolated that it kind of takes away the context of it. And so I remember in my Spanish 1 classes, I wanted to say what do I have? Do you have this? Or I want to do this, and having conversations with my classes. But the word quiere didn't come up until stem changing verbs, which was, 5 or 6 chapters into a textbook. But quiere is one of the most words, the words that I use the most in my level 1 classes and level 2 classes. I mean, how much do kids want to talk about, I want to do this?
They shouldn't get to talk about their wants. They should have to talk about cleaning the house.
Exactly. So this is typical textbook. Every textbook, no matter really what textbook you get, this is the format that's used. And we have this idea as teachers that this is the best way to learn language. And it's kind of been ingrained in us that because all of these textbooks look the same and because they're all formatted the same, that this must be the best way. So what I was trying to do when I first started out, when I was a newbie teacher, I was like, okay, they can have a textbook in their first couple of years, but I want to step away from that. And so I tried to have content-based units, things that I found interesting. But I also spent weeks on grammar. We had a preterite and imperfect unit, and I was trying to use stories, but at the end of the day, they were not getting preterite and perfect. I was training them to fill in a blank instead of giving them language that they could use. And so I took this screenshot. I'm so embarrassed by this. I took this screenshot. I had my Spanish 3 students complete a term paper because that's how I learned. I learned this way. So I thought, surely my students would be able to get this. I mean, it's just a bunch of memorizing and like just follow the rules, dang it. Like it's not hard. But I had trouble with some of these things. So like giving them this like checklist of, hey, check these things in your writing because these are the things that you should be doing right all the time. And so like even using Sarah and a star properly, pour and para properly, like those are things that I'm like, okay, is like even 10 years into teaching, almost 11, and studying in high school and studying in college and studying abroad. And like, these are things that I have to think about as a non-native teacher. And I was asking my students to do more than what I could. And so this is why it didn't work. It wasn't acquisition based, and it definitely wasn't proficiency based. I compartmentalized these grammar concepts and they didn't get it. I threw a lot of content at them, but that content wasn't comprehensible. I was more focused on can they understand the content versus learning the content. Like they were trying to figure out what all the words meant instead of the content that I was trying to teach them. I wasn't trying to necessarily get them to teach like to learn language, but that's what I was asking them to do. And it should be the opposite of learning the content through language that's accessible on them. And I was super focused on accuracy. I think that when I started to really understand proficiency and learn that like the way that I learned, I was the exception
Yes.
to that textbook, because I was a grammar person. Like I was that kid in 5th grade who gave the grammar lesson in English that nobody else understood. Like I was that weirdo. So I was the exception, and I was acting and teaching as if every one of those students was like me. And they're not. They're all different. They all have different abilities, and they are, some of them are not very good academically. Like they're not good at memorizing things, or they're not good at remembering rules. And so I needed to honor that. And I wanted to get students to feel like they could achieve no matter what proficiency level they were at, no matter where they were, and to kind of honor them where they were. So when I started to incorporate the Huellas units into my upper level classes, the students really became the center point. And so I think as teachers, it's important to learn that we can't move faster than where they are. So we just, and especially for the school year, I think it's extremely important to remember that in this school year, we just have to meet students where they are. We can't force the acquisition upon them that they were not able to have access to during the last maybe 18 months. There are some students that I haven't seen in 18 months. So we have to really just meet them where they are. And because of the types of units that we have, it really honors that natural language progression. It gives students grammar in chunks so that they can use some of that really higher order thinking, along with those higher level, like complex grammar structures. They can use them. They don't have to like memorize, oh, well, it comes from this word and I need to do this to the ending. And you just give it to them. And so that language is usable right then and there. They can easily access it because they know exactly what it means. You tell them what it means. It's not like this like puzzle that they have to figure out. It focuses on communication, and then it creates this idea of functioning proficiency instead of accuracy, meaning that I can understand what they're saying, their peers can understand what they're saying, and they might not be 100% right, because even as a non-native teacher, I'm not 100% right. And I was asking way too much of my students when I was trying to do a textbook, because there's a right and wrong answer with a textbook. Whereas this is very open-ended. It's more focused on what they can do, and it doesn't highlight what they can't.
I love that.
And that's one of my favorite things about like switching from a textbook to proficiency based, because an acquisition based, and like really understanding the research behind that, because it allows students to feel successful, and they might not feel successful in any other classes. But because we're like, hey, like the standard is what you make it. Like I can say this is what our target is. And because of the research, I know that this is about where you are. But if you're not there yet, it's okay. Like we'll get there. And they're like, oh, like all right, that's not too bad. Like I can do this Spanish thing.
Yes.
So where does Huellas fit into all of this? So in a unit, typically what you're going to see is that meaningful content that students can connect to. And that was one of the highlights when I started using Carrie's units in my classes. Kids wanted to know more. Like they wanted to know more than what I was giving them. And they were going off and watching documentaries on their own. And we were able to bring those discussions into the classroom because it was something that they really were interested in. And they weren't learning about these topics in other classes either. So they got to have these real world conversations about real world topics and things that mattered to them. I think when you have a student-centered program and students feel like they have a voice on like, hey, like this is a problem, let's talk about it. And you can bring that into the classroom using a lot of these units. The target structures, students are exposed to them throughout the unit. So whether it's through a class story or whether it's through a cultural reading or whether it's in a song, like they're hearing these structures over and over again so that it feels natural for them to want to be able to use them. And those grammar bubbles, kind of like what I was talking about before, those are really just a means for them to have communication access. Like to just say like, if I were, or if I had, then I would do this. You don't have to go through like, well, you know, this is the imperfect subjunctive and this is the conditional, because they're really not getting a whole lot of grammar instruction in their English classes anymore. And so like to throw these grammarian terms at them, they're like, all right, like, how do I use it? Like, they just want to know how to use it. And like, I think about times when I've had conversations about grammar with native speakers, and it just gets awkward. Like we're not in an academic environment when these conversations happen. And so like they just talk. They're like, yeah, well, this is just how we say it. Like, and so like I remember there was one time when I was in a car with somebody and they were using Vos a lot. And one of the people I was traveling with was like, so like what ending do you like on your verbs do you use with that? And I'm like, oh, they don't, this is like like it got silent in the car. And like I remember thinking like, well, just listen, like just listen to it. Like we can't have these conversations about grammar, like you just have to listen to it. And
I
that's
think that
kind
a
of like,
lot when Nellie is proofing something and I'm like, well, why is it that way? And she's like, it just sounds right that way. Like
exactly, like this is just how we talk, it just sounds better.
And I can't explain things in English a lot of times, like, well, why would you say it that way? I don't know. That's just how it is.
Exactly, that's just how it is. And so by giving students language, that's just how it is. Like they don't question where it comes from. And like you are going to have those students who are like, now, like if I wanted to do this with this, and like you can explain that to them. Anytime that happens, if I have a kid who's like me, who is the exception, I'm always like, all right, so I'm going to have this conversation with her and you can listen in if you want to. If it's going to confuse the heck out of you, just ignore me. And so I had that conversation with that one exception student and like I get to like live in my little grammar dream world for 5 minutes and then we move on. And like that student may or may not remember that lesson. I don't know, but they wanted to know it in that moment and I explained it to them and we moved on. And I think that like the way that we introduce grammar in these units is just like it's completely reflective of the assessments. Like we want to see what students can do. So it's not about being able like, and I think about textbook tests and quizzes where it is very black and white. You have to have the endings right. You have to be able to fill in the words correctly in the blank. You have to be able to, and I think of like written prompts in certain chapters where they're like, make sure to use the conditional, make sure to use X amount of verbs that have this stipulation to them. And there are sometimes when I have students that have said like in the past, like, I can't do that. Like I can write, and that was when they were giving me writing that had a whole bunch of infinitives in it. And it was because I wasn't giving them the word for he or she wants or I want. Like they were using that word that was exposed to them in their vocabulary list, but the vocabulary can be encapsulated in that grammar part. Like they're one and the same. And so when I started to take away this, like, well, this is where this word comes from, I stopped seeing that in their writing. And it was amazing because I was like, oh, well, this makes sense. Like, why was I not doing this before? And I think it's because we get in that mindset of like, this is how it should be presented. This is what students need to know. This is what they should know. But at the end of the day, we want students to be able to communicate something, and we want them to be able to have language that they can use and they can use now, because not all of them are going to go off and be Spanish teachers, and they're going to need language. I mean, we would like it, especially with the current shortage, but like we need to be able to give them language that they can use now, whether it's in their job, whether it's in a class that they have to take at university, like we want, or whether it's a community member that they have an interaction with. Like we want them to be able to get that language that they can use right now. And I think that's why the assessments that we do take the language that they've been exposed to throughout the unit, whether it was in the song, whether it was in the articles that they read or the videos that they watched, and they can show us what they can do with confidence. They've had so much exposure to language and they've had so much exposure to content that they feel confident going into those assessments and being like, yeah, this is something I can talk about for sure. Am I going to make mistakes? Absolutely. But guess what? My teacher said that was fine because that's proficiency and I don't have to be 100% accurate. And so I think when we get beyond that idea of accuracy and like incorporating X amount of grammar structures and an assessment, and we just say like, hey kids, what can you do with this? They will really surprise you with what they can do. And so this is the last thing that I kind of wanted to leave on. And it's the idea that changing upper level views of language can open those opportunities for all students. So I have had in the past when I was at my other school and I was the upper language teacher, and you know, they had heard all of these things like, well, they speak Spanish all the time. You can't speak in English. It's too hard. I can't, here were some of my favorites. I'm not good at grammar and I can't memorize vocabulary. And so when they had those types of experiences in those lower level classes, and then they got to my classes and they were like, wait, this is different. Like I don't feel like I have to memorize so much. And they also feel like it's effortless. And I think that that's based, and it really is. As long, and we have this conversation now, I teach levels 1 and 2 at the current school that I'm in, and we have these conversations quite frequently where I say like, this class should feel effortless. Like you should be able to come in and just listen and see what things are and see what I'm doing and look at words and the meanings that I have written on the board. And as long as you are with me and you're not distracted by something else, this should feel effortless. And if it doesn't, then I need to do something on my end, or we need to have a conversation in terms of like, what are things that we could do better together? But I think when they have this idea that language is hard in those lower levels and they don't go on to those upper levels, that was when we started to see this transition in the lower levels. And so we started using the Somos curriculum by Martina Bex in those lower levels. And then more students wanted to go on because they felt successful in those first 2 levels. And so I think that when you start incorporating these units, so the Huellas units, if you're a Spanish 3, Spanish 4 AP teacher, and you start incorporating these units in and they're not really reflective of what's happening in those lower levels, this could really open the door to have those conversations with your colleagues of like, hey, these are some of the things that I'm seeing in the upper levels. And these are the successes that I'm having in the upper levels. How can we get more students to take these classes? And how can we make them feel more successful in those lower level students if they can't memorize vocabulary, if they don't understand grammar rules? So by incorporating the Huellas units, that's where I got started. And that was what allowed me to reflect on what needed to happen in those lower levels. Cause I was like, oh, those foundational, they need those grammar. And they don't. They just build on what they have in those lower levels in the Huellas units. And they can really have those deep discussions and like have those like powerful moments in class because they're using language that they understand. So I mean, I told Carrie that I could talk about this a lot because I went through like multiple transitions between like being a first year teacher and like not having a curriculum in level 3 and 4 to starting to incorporate her units to be like, oh, like what can we do in levels 1 and 2? And then like switching schools and having these conversations again with colleagues. Like it's really important that we like honor kids where they are and like make them feel successful and like celebrate their triumphs. And I think that with the Huellas units, the way that they're structured, those upper level programs can grow really, really strong. I mean, we want students to take more than those required 2 years. And especially when it's literally going to be required by our whole state pretty soon. So a lot of states are looking at that. And so you really want to build momentum for your program and make them feel successful. And these are the types of units that are going to do that for them and make them feel like world changers too, because, you know, that's an added bonus of a lot of the units in the Huellas curriculum. So, but yeah, I could talk about that a lot. However, it is summertime and we wanted to make sure to keep your summer valuable and not waste too much time.
Sustainable, off the computer.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for sharing with us. We just really appreciate you and your point of view, and big applause for Melissa, because this is the woman who made all of these curriculum maps, the Huellas 1 and 2 curriculum maps that are now both ready. Yesterday, Nellie was able to proof the Huellas 2 curriculum map, so they're set to go, and we're excited about that little addition for back to school. Thanks again, Melissa, and tomorrow we'll be back with you. Tomorrow I'm going to talk to you. So Melissa gave you some great things like as you're moving away from the textbook, but sometimes we know that that's not even a possibility. Like what if it's like a millstone tied around your neck and you're like drowning in textbook units. So tomorrow we're going to come back and give you some suggestions. If you have to be tied to a textbook, how can you make these Huellas units, like all the things, I love all the things Melissa said, because I've observed the same things in my classroom. Like kids are more successful and they stay in longer and they go home and they research further on topics that, like, you know, that did not happen when it was household chores. And so what do we do to make that textbook work alongside of a CI curriculum? So have a great day today, and we'll see you back tomorrow for Sustainable Day 3. Bye.